Welcome to the Think Factory podcast. We got one question for you. What keeps you up at night?
Hello and welcome to the Women's Roundtable podcast powered by the Think Factory, where we learn how women think big and grow their business. My name is Susan Kleiner. I'm a partner with Outside General Counsel Solutions, and I'm the host of today's episode. I'm happy to have with me today Tricia Baker, the co-founder of AIR, Attitudes in Reverse, a nonprofit whose mission is to start conversations about mental health issues and student suicide prevention. Certified therapy dogs are a big part of Tricia's advocacy work in schools, as petting a dog releases oxytocin, serotonin, and dopamine and lowers cortisol levels, which is great. I'm so happy to have you here. It's been great getting to know you, and your story is, amazing, and I'm looking forward to sharing your story and your important work with our guests. So welcome today to our episode, Tricia.
Thank you so much. It's truly an honor to be here to speak with you today and with everybody.
Thank you. So just to get things started, could you tell people a little bit more about AIR, Attitudes in Reverse, and, what led you to co-founding this organization?
The story of AIR is a very personal one and a tough story. When my son was 15 years old, he was diagnosed with a mental health disorder. We had no idea that he was affected by an anxiety, depression, and he had suicidal ideation. And he spent 3 years trying to get healthy, trying to get well, and he battled. We all battled as a family. And unfortunately, in May of 2009, we all lost our battle, and he did end his life by suicide. And after he died, there was a lot of misunderstanding and some discrimination about his memory and about how he died, because people do not understand suicide's a symptom of a brain illness. People don't understand these are mental illnesses, and no one chooses to have a mental illness. And we also knew that there were a lot of other young people who were out there struggling like Kenny, who were embarrassed and afraid to talk openly. Kenny was actually embarrassed. He lied about his illness for over 3 years. He told everybody he had mono. He didn't want people to make fun of him. He didn't want to be bullied or ridiculed or targeted. So we knew we needed to do something, and that's how Attitudes in Reverse, or AIR, was born. And AIR represents mental illness. Mental illness is like air. Just because you don't see it, it's all around us. 1 in 4 people in society are affected.
Well, that's a lot. I want to thank you for your openness. I find it to be so refreshing and good to talk about these issues that are so hard to talk about. And obviously, my deepest condolences for the loss of Kenny.
Thank you.
And I know that from when I spoke to you, I feel like I had kind of a revelation from the first time, where when we talk about these difficult issues, it's like people tiptoe about it. But really, what we're talking about with mental health is your brain is ill. Like, you have a brain illness. It's like cancer. It's like any childhood disease. And I think that if we can reframe the conversation to talk about brain illness and helping people get their brains to be better, right? Like more healthy or whatever it is, like it, and talk about it that way, it would help reduce some of the stigma.
I agree 100%. And that's what all of our programs are based on. We talk about brain illnesses. We talk about, just like hearts can get sick, hearts can also get better. Just like brains can sometimes get sick, brains can also get better. We want young people to understand that their brain illnesses, there's support, and there's treatment available. And the earlier that they start treatment, the more likely the success of the treatment. Half of all these brain illnesses will present by the age of 14. And just like with cancer or any other debilitating illness, the sooner you start treatment, the more likely the success of the treatment. Why it's important to talk to students young and early.
So that's also an amazing thing about Attitudes in Reverse. You're talking directly to students, for students. And how young, what is the youngest age level that you go in and speak with?
We start out in high school and college age, but then what we started to see was that there was a significant need in the middle school. So we have created programs that are age specific for middle schoolers. We actually have identified up to 50% of sixth graders in one school district who were looking for help for themselves or for a friend. 50%. I mean, that's so significant. And then what I did during COVID was I started to recognize that our little ones were going to start to struggle because they were out of school. They were losing this human connection. So I developed a book. I wrote a book about dogs and their emotions and how there's a lot of overlap between dog emotions and human emotions. So the book is called Mickey and Friends Go to School. It's exploring emotions through the eyes of a dog. But what it helps a little person do, it helps them identify what they're feeling, to be able to label it. And all of our programs are very focused on help seeking, letting them know about that safe, trusted adult who cares and who wants to listen and who will help them connect them to supports if they need it.
That's tremendous. And I know you talked about dogs. You have a special connection to dogs, and dogs are actually a really important part of your programming. I'd love to hear some more about that. Can you explain what you do with the therapy dogs?
I am happy to share information about our dogs. So dogs are part of every single one of our programs. So as I mentioned, with the kindergarten through fourth grade, it's a story. It's about dogs. At the end of the story, the students get to meet one of my dogs who's in the book. So they think it's so super special that they're meeting a celebrity. When I was up in West New York, we started out with the older students, and every grade gets to meet a dog. So they got to meet, my dog's name is Goober, the goofy Goober. So they got to meet Goober. And then by the time I got talking to the little ones, they're like, is that Goober? And then they all knew who he was because they heard from their cousin, their brother, all about Goober. And I also had 200 fifth graders singing Happy Birthday to Goober, which just touched my heart. So dogs are part of the middle school program and the high school program. And it's important because some of the topics we're touching, especially for the little bit older kids, they're really tough topics. It's really hard for the older students. I do share a story of my son, and it's a tough story for little ones to hear, but I feel we need to be honest with them and, again, let them know what these illnesses are. But then at the very end, they get to meet a dog. And as you mentioned in the beginning, all those positive things that happen to the human brain when you interact with a dog. So I've been at schools where a student after the program is very upset and crying, and she refused to get up and talk to a counselor. Well, I sat down next to her with my dog, and I said, do you want to pet my dog? And she's crying, and she shakes her head yes. And then I said, do you want him on your lap? And she's still crying, and I put him on her lap, and then she's petting. She stopped crying within 2 minutes. She stopped crying, and then I said, you want to talk to a counselor now? And she shook her head, and she got up, and she walked away with the counselor. So that's what a little dog did for her on that day of that tough topic. The other thing that a report comes back to me is that from the administrators is that the students will remember the material far longer because they associate it with meeting the dog. Yeah. So it's just amazing. I have one superintendent, and he calls the dogs magic, to see how the students respond to the dogs and how it can have an impact on their studying and lowering their stress before a test. And it's amazing. And if I can add at this time, we also do crisis support. So if there's a student death or a sudden staff member death, we will go. We will go to the school. We've gone to one school's graduation twice because they had 2 deaths in consecutive years. And then from that came our school-based program. One superintendent said to me they lost a student. They had every counselor in the media center. All the students were there. They had counselors from the district, from the county, and not one student was talking. And then he said the dogs came into the room and life came back into the room.
Yes.
And the kids sat on the floor with the dogs, and then the counselor sat on the floor with the kids, and the healing process started. And a week later, he called me and he goes, I would like to start a school-based program where we have one dog on every school property every day. That was Dr. Thomas Smith in Hopewell Valley. And we have about 70 dogs now across New Jersey that are school-based dogs. They train with their school staff member, and the school staff member is able to bring that dog to school to work with them in order to help provide support and safety to students and as well as staff.
Wow, that's so amazing and so great. And I know, I've actually heard about dogs being used in courtrooms, especially when kids are testifying or during criminal trials. So really, I think, pretty amazing that you're able to talk about these tough topics, but having the dogs with you makes you more accessible and helps bring us together. So I'm curious too, like how did you make the connection where you first started? I mean, how did dogs get into the picture after you co-founded Attitudes in Reverse?
After the death of Kenny, I was struggling. I was having a really hard time, getting up and functioning like a human being was really hard. And my little dog, Mickey, who's a Pomeranian, what he did in the morning, and he never did this before and he hasn't done it since, but he knew when I couldn't get out of bed, he would actually lay on my chest and he'd lick my eyelids. Get up, time to get up, Mom. So I'd get up. And then I started bringing him places with me, and he was certified as a service dog. So he came places with me where I was starting to have, PTSD responses or some anxiety responses. And he started coming into schools. And in the very beginning, everyone's like, you can't bring that dog into school. And I said, well, he's actually my service dog. He helps me get through these tough things that I'm doing. Because presenting Kenny's story to students was really hard for me in the very beginning. Sometimes I get choked up. But he came, and then we started seeing the response that students had. And then we started getting calls from schools like, are you the ones who have the dogs? And it just kind of grew from there. We do a lot of wellness events, township wellness events. And what we found too, Mickey was always with me, that if we didn't have the dog, people would walk by our table.
Yeah.
Mental illness, suicide doesn't pertain to me. Not my child.
Not my child.
They would come up without thinking and they'd start to pet the dog. And then after about 10 minutes of interacting about dogs, they would say, what does AIR stand for? And then we would share our story, Kenny's story. And 9 out of 10 people, after spending that time petting the dog, I have a story too. It's my brother, my mother, my father, my neighbor, my cousin, someone they knew was either struggling with significant mental health issues or had died by suicide. So that little dog was able to break down the barriers of stigma. And then he just started going more and more places with us, and we just started seeing all the wonderful positive responses, students and staff had. And I'm also a dog trainer, so I wear 2 hats. I'm a mental health advocate as well as a dog trainer. So just in all of my studying of dogs, I started to see all these similarities, and that's where we started to grow that school-based program. So my daughter and I are the 2 trainers. We go in and we'll work with the schools and we train the staff with their dogs. And I will tell you, it's very rewarding because the mental health side sometimes can be really hard. Yeah. But then balance it with dogs and people who love dogs. So I always say it helps me keep my life in balance.
For sure. I mean, otherwise it would be, I mean, let's face it, it's heavy stuff, and people don't want to talk about it. But I think having, that connector, right? Having the dog is not just helpful for kids, but also adults. So we were talking just before, and you were telling me that in addition to presenting for kids and, going to schools and conferences, you're also brought in to educate parents. And, obviously this is a huge issue. We're always hearing about it, about mental health with our kids. And I would say that, issues with addiction and alcohol abuse go hand in hand with this. All things we don't like to talk about. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you're doing with parents and helping parents, and, what you're doing to, hopefully, lessen the stigma of talking about these things.
Yeah, I think talking to parents is so important because, as I said earlier, a lot of parents are still not understanding. I've had parents say to me, my child's too smart to have a mental illness. Mm-hmm. Well, my son was incredibly smart. When he was 6 years old, he was tested, and we found he had the long-term memory of a 29-year-old. It's those smart, gifted kids that you have to worry about. I always say they feel things deeper than the average person. And it's just important, and I always, if I'm going into a school, I always say, well, do you want to do a parent program first? Because I think it's important so that when we talk to parents, they know then that their students within the next day or two are going to have the same conversation. Now they can have that conversation together. Yeah. I think, an educated conversation without judgment, without criticism. One of the things that's an obstacle in parents' understanding too is puberty occurs around the same time that these mental health issues occur. Half of these mental health issues will start before the age of 14, right around when puberty is happening. So a lot of parents will say, you know what? It's a phase. You'll grow out of it. It might be a phase, but it might not be. How do we get the students to know? How do we get the parents to understand? So it's something that needs to be checked out. Maybe they need an evaluation. Find out what's going on. And if it's puberty, that's great. That's just normal development. But if there's something else, and maybe it's another medical illness, or maybe it's a learning disability, whatever's going on, we want to help that child and that family, the parents, to help identify what's going on so that they can get the proper supports that they need so they can be happy and healthy.
And to be able to talk about it without shame. So it sounds like you're really creating an opening, right? So your work is just one part of, a bigger process that needs to happen. And I think that kind of leads me to talk a little bit about the timing of this podcast. I mean, you and I talked about it, and we wanted it to come out in March or April, and I just thought maybe it would be helpful for you to touch upon that.
Yeah, it's interesting because most people think that the most suicides occur during the holidays, and that's actually a fallacy. More people will experience suicidal ideation, will experience mental health disorders in the months of March and April, or die by suicide, sadly, in the months of March and April. And that's because everybody experiences a winter funk. But most of us, if we have healthy brains, we just pull ourselves out of it come springtime. The flowers are blooming, the sun is out, it's warm. But if someone is experiencing medical, clinical depression, they don't pull themselves out of it. Right. But what they see is they see everybody else, and it just magnifies their overwhelming sadness, and they lose hope. So that's why it's so important this time of year, people to be aware of that, and the one thing I want to share, especially with parents, is, it's okay to ask your child if they're thinking of hurting themselves. It's okay. The old belief was that if you talk to people, especially young people, about suicide, it put the idea in their head.
Yeah.
They're now just coming out with understanding, because we've been saying for 14 years, we have to educate young people so that they understand their brain illnesses. It's a genetic illness. If you talk to somebody who has a healthy brain, they're not going to go hurt themselves. But if you're talking to somebody with an unhealthy brain who's struggling, we want to make sure they know they have permission to ask for help. And that's one of the biggest obstacles that we still face these days. Like when my son died, the response was, let's put a sticker over his picture in the yearbook.
Yeah.
Let's not say his name in the building. They wanted to erase his existence because the feeling at that time by most of the professionals were, if you talked about the kid who died by suicide, you were going to get more suicides. If you talk to everyone else and let them know that there's help, they will reach out and ask for help. The day that Kenny was first diagnosed, he was doing some erratic things. He disappeared. And I called my good friend who was a child psychologist, and she said, take him to the ER. I had no idea what she was talking about. I had no idea, no comprehension of anything that was ahead of us. No idea, but I know I needed to take him to the ER. So when I found him, I said, Kenny, let's go to the hospital. Not one word of argument. He got up. He walked with me. He got in. He knew he needed help. He did not know how to ask for it. He didn't know. And the thing I find with young people today, too, is, they don't want to add to their parents' burden.
Yeah.
They don't want to disappoint their parents. So they say, I'm going to handle this on my own. And they don't have to. We want them to know that, people care. Parents care. They may not understand it at first, but they truly care and they want to help. And, there's so many teachers who care and counselors who care. I always tell everybody, when I'm in a school, I know how much that administration and those counselors and those teachers care because they invited me in. Mm-hmm. They invited me in. They wanted those kids to hear AIR's message of hope and know that there's always hope and there's always support available for them.
Right. So that's so powerful. So we need to talk about it, and we need to ask our kids these difficult questions and normalize having these conversations where we talk about these big bad things that we used to only talk about in hushed rooms, we wouldn't talk about how someone died because it's too shameful. But instead we must talk about, dying by suicide and, how are you feeling and do you feel like hurting yourself? So, I can see the point of starting the conversation, normalizing it, ending the stigma. Here's a question for you in case someone's listening. What happens if you have that difficult conversation with your kid or your kid says to you, I want to hurt myself. And it's a parent maybe like unfamiliar with the territory. What is someone to do to reach out and get help?
So the first thing I say is take a deep breath and to hug your child, to make sure your child knows that they're loved no matter what. And then you want to find them the resources. Schools very often have lists of counselors, community counselors. I would get the school involved. Sometimes parents don't want to get schools involved, but the school needs to understand what's going on as well. I used to say it's always like a triad of support, right? You have the child working hard to get well. You have the parents supporting the child, and you need to have the school supporting the child as well. It's just as important. And then, find a counselor who connects with your child. And that's not so easy these days because there's a shortage of counselors out there in New Jersey and around the world. So you have to find somebody who can help guide your child, so that they understand that they can get help and talk through some of these issues. Medication may be needed, that varies, from child to child. I'm not a doctor, so I can't really speak that much to it, but medication might be needed. And just keep loving your child. The best advice I can give to a parent with a child with a mental illness is separate the child from the illness. Because I used to have two Kennys. I had the healthy Kenny, who was this amazing, caring, thoughtful, loving young man. He was the sweetest human being. And then I had the Kenny who had a significant brain illness, who would do erratic, things. Like he stole the car once and he drove it to Princeton and he left it there and we had to find it because it was his unhealthy brain was telling him to do these things. So just understand, because this is really hard for us. This is hard for, I think, all of us, that because we judge people based on behavior. So we have to look at the person and understand that some of these behaviors are the illness behaviors, not your child's behaviors, but the illness behaviors. So if you can separate out and remember, this is my child. I love you so much. I love you with my whole heart, my whole soul. I do whatever I can to help you and support you. Whatever that might be. It might be time in the hospital. I mean, Kenny was hospitalized 6 times in 3 years, and that might be what they need at that time to keep them safe. But just let them know that they're loved. And that's really the best advice I can give.
Right. Well, thank you for that. So, looking back, I mean, it's been years, since Kenny died and, you started this organization. I imagine you've learned a ton over the years. I'm curious, though, that if you could go back to your younger self, right, is there a piece of advice that you would give to your younger self?
Yes, I would, because I was one of those people who didn't understand mental illness. I was one of those people who judged people by behaviors. So I have found that I have become much more empathetic and compassionate towards others. And I probably should have started that earlier on, but we don't know, we don't realize. So, I think it's the best thing.
Well, and also compassion for oneself, right? I mean, dealing with a child with mental illness is incredibly difficult. And so we also need to take care of ourselves and get the help that we need, right?
That's true. And that's really hard sometimes. I always describe the illness. So not the child, but the illness would suck all the air out of the room, leaving nothing behind for anybody else. And it's really hard to find that support for yourself as well. Right.
So what's next for you and for Attitudes in Reverse and, the use, your therapy dogs and that business?
So we just became evidence-based. We would have been evidence-based prior to COVID, but unfortunately COVID stopped the world. But we've completed all the research. We've been doing research with the College of New Jersey, the TAP Lab. And my hope is just to keep building our programs, being able to reach more young people. To date, I've talked to over 175,000 young people, and that's just not here, just in New Jersey. That's in 8 states outside of New Jersey as well. I would love to be able to continue growing the dog program. I would love to have a dog in every school in New Jersey. It's just, there's challenges, there's limitations, there's, financial challenges is probably one of the biggest obstacles that we face. You mentioned earlier about my employees. I do have a few part-time employees, but it's really hard, to hire people. And that's why it's mostly, me and our family. And as I said, I have some really great helpers, but it's probably the most challenging, because I compete against others that, do get state or federal funding and they offer programs for free. I can't do that because everything costs me money. So I guess that's probably my biggest challenge is hopefully we can overcome that and, just keep doing what we're doing, keep reaching more kids, keep training more dogs, and because right now we're in a mental health crisis. Kids are dying all around us. We lost a student in Princeton this past weekend. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking.
Absolutely heartbreaking. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. As I said, just keep doing. It's interesting. I have found. So I have a degree in art, graphic design. That's where I started from. I worked in Manhattan, then I worked at Merrill Lynch. I managed their studio, the graphic art studio. But I just keep my eyes open. I keep my heart open, and then I just keep growing. I see where there's a need. Like when Kenny died, we saw there was a need to support students and to let them know that, if you're struggling, there's help out there. And then we saw the need was for younger students. So then we developed the program for younger students. And we don't really talk about suicide for the younger students because we took into consideration all the concern about contagion. We respect the concern about contagion. And then during COVID, we saw there was going to be a need for younger folks. And then we saw the need of how the dogs were helping. So I have to say I've been really blessed, in everything that we've been doing. You look, you see a need, and we've been able to fill that need to the best of our ability. And I hope I just keep doing that.
Yeah. So this is a good time. I mean, Attitudes in Reverse is a 501c3 nonprofit. So if people are inclined, they could go to your website, and I assume there's a place to make a donation. How can people connect with you? Like, what is your website and how can they find you?
So the website is https://air.ngo. I know it's a little long. I'll say it again. It's https://air.ngo. And if somebody wants to email me, they can email me at Tricia, Tricia, @air.ngo.
Great. And so that would be obviously people that are interested in your programming, people who are looking to donate, learn more, maybe people from other states who might hear this, because it sounds like a program that is worthy of replication.
So one thing I will add, I didn't mention, is our hope is, hopefully, that we can license the program, to your point, so that we can share it beyond New Jersey. We can share it so that more kids can, participate. So that's the next goal, is like the licensing part of it.
Well, we'll have to talk more about that offline.
Yes.
Our final question, that we ask everyone that appears on our Think Factory podcast is, what keeps you up at night?
There's a lot that keeps me up at night. I don't sleep very well. I tend to be a worrier. Like I mentioned earlier, I have a little bit of an anxiety disorder. It's manageable, but it's tough. And I worry about the kids that I meet. I meet a lot of young people who are struggling, so many who are struggling. We've had several young people right after our program go right to the ER because they did not know what was going on with themselves. They did not know that they could ask for help. So I worry about all of them, and a lot of them come up to me after we talk and, they touch my heart. So I was talking to one young man who was a freshman, and he told me that his cousin died 6 years earlier of suicide. He says, until today, I did not know why. So that means for 6 years, this young man was thinking and struggling with these thoughts. Because a lot of times people, when they lose someone to suicide, they blame themselves, and one of the things I try to get them to understand is that it's this illness.
Right.
And there's a strong genetic component to it. So, and they hide it really well. They hide it so well. And so we should all be kind to each other. We should all be kind to each other. And if you feel a friend is struggling, you reach out. But you can't blame yourself if they hid it so well, this illness, that you didn't see it. Or you weren't educated to know what it was. So things like that. I worry about all our young people. I don't know. They're not mine. I always say I feel like they're mine. I have 165,000 students or kids in my life.
Well, I'm grateful that you're out there, in your organization doing your good work, to try and make an impact and talk to people and talk to young people, to learn this, incredibly valuable lesson. So I want to thank you so much for coming here today to talk about your organization and your experience, your mission and your hope. It's been really great. So be sure to check out our other Women's Roundtable podcasts so you can learn how women think big and grow their business.
Thank you so much. I really, truly appreciate the honor of being here and speaking to everybody today. Thank you.
Thank you.